All right, we are recording now.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the farm. Today we have with us Colin Reid, Steven Snider is back, and Christopher Knowles, and Frank Zero, as always. Mysterious serpent mountains and the remains of ancient structures seem to function as modern gateways to other worlds. Parallel crypto-terrestrial civilizations have made contact with humanity throughout history in the form of bizarre rituals, often centered around humans who wandered alone into these places. From the fairy, fae, and elven races to the gray aliens, often accompanied by a spectacle of similar disorienting lights, all kinds of beings and varied experiences sprout from these areas already inherently tied by their inner ley line circuitry. Peter Levenda's Sinister Forces series illustrates how these very areas were the birthplaces of multiple well-known American serial killers and the intelligence operations surrounding them, whether that be geared toward mind control experiments or habitual UFO sightings. So, Colin, when you were growing up in Scotland, am I right?
Yep.
What kind of otherworldly run-ins did you have? What kind of beings did you run into, or what were those experiences like?
Well, the first major thing that I remember, I'll probably give a tiny little bit of context from where I'm from first. I mean, I grew up in a little village called Clackmannan in Clackmannanshire in central Scotland. What that name actually means is Stone of Manow, and I think Manow was a Bronze Age river god. And in the centre of our village where I grew up, there was actually a gigantic standing stone that looks like one of the Stonehenge, like menhirs or whatever, and it looks like a giant penis. But that's by and by. So it was all there was a slight Wicker Man vibe in the village. They used to have May Day celebrations, and I do believe people would actually dance around the giant stone penis. But anyway, so I was living in this little village, which is actually ancillary to the Bonnybridge Triangle area. So there's a number of towns around there, like Falkirk, Grangemouth, Stirling, where certainly in the 90s there was a high proportion of reported encounters and incidents of people seeing things and a lot of black triangle sightings. Um, so anyway, so the encounter that I had happened, I'd say it was when I was about five or so. So that would have been about 1984. And really, it was, I remember, it's a very brief encounter, but it will come of more significance in a bit. I woke up what I felt like maybe about 3 in the morning, which of course is the witching hour, and I shared a bedroom with my brother. And I glanced across the room and it was dark. And over at the other side of the room, seemingly searching through one of my closets or drawers, there was a figure, like an adult sized human figure, that their appearance was like, oh, I sort of came to describe it as like a moonlit person. Like they had no features, but they were almost like a sort of somebody had put a cardboard cutout of a human being. The closest thing I could compare it to in a sort of pop culture sense would have been the aliens from Cocoon, if you know that movie, the glowing, flying alien people. So there was this figure looking in my drawers. And there was a point where I was struck with a feeling of terror. And then this figure became aware of me and seemed to turn around and look at me, even though there was no face, there was no features. It was an entirely featureless thing that just looked like a person. And I was struck with this feeling of terror. The thing turned around and looked at me. And then I felt an immediate sense of, oh, this doesn't really matter. Think about it tomorrow. And my head went down, and I seem to recall being asleep before my head went on the pillow. So this only, I mean, you could argue it was some sort of a hallucination or something like that, or a sleep paralysis type fever incident. But anyway, a few years after later,
Not to cut you off, but if
yeah,
we were to just quickly classify that kind of being, like just with all cryptids and experiences that people have and stuff, it's almost like a shadow person, but
yeah,
the opposite, and even kind of
yeah,
acts like that. Although because where you're located, we might assume this is more of a mischievous or a positive being, because there's sort of a history in Scotland of, light beings or other beings that don't look like that, but are up to some mischief of some kind.
Yeah, I've thought about it a lot over the years because it really stayed with me, this, and it sort of haunted me a little bit, even though it was like a tiny memory. And,
Totally.
it just felt incredibly strange. And it was one of those outliers where it doesn't line up with normal reality. And I remember asking my parents the next morning, did you come into my room last night? And they never did. Normally they said, no, of course not. Yeah, but
On the next one, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, it could have been, it could have been a number of things. If it was an intelligent being from some other place, you could say it was a fairy, it was an angel or an elemental, or a light being. And again, when I say light being, that maybe is sort of more sort of contacty sort of allusions to it. There's that spiritual element, if you say it's a thing of light, or a religious component. And I've never had any sort of religious upbringing. So of course we have our own sort of cultural filter that these things go through. So I've kind of always sort of, there was a point probably when I thought, wow, maybe this is aliens. But I've come along now to just being sort of slightly agnostic about it and slightly undecided.
And did anything else happen in your childhood like that, or
Well,
isolated?
I was thinking about this notion of sort of spiritual beings or sort of supernatural beings being sort of bound to the landscape and nature, of course. And where I grew up was actually quite rural. It's very much a sort of a liminal part of Scotland where you're away from most places. And after I lived in this little village, we moved for a while to a bungalow, a little isolated sort of cottage on farmland. So we were kind of even more out in the middle of nowhere. And in that little bungalow that we lived in, there was some weird poltergeist type. There's a couple of sort of weird poltergeist type encounters I had, and my mother actually had a very strange incident, which I sort of witnessed in my brother as well, where she seemed to experience a time slip, where she was walking down the corridor of the house, and all of a sudden she felt all of the lights went out, and she reached in front of her and felt that there was a stone wall that had water running down it. So she was suddenly in this sort of dark, pitch black stone cavern. And me and my brother could hear her shouting as if she was, and we remember thinking she's somewhere outside the house. But she said she was, in fact, where she was geographically was right outside our bedroom door. And she was in this sort of altered state, and then she was there for a few seconds. It was one of those things, like my thing, that it only lasted a few seconds, and then she was back again. So there was that, and there was some odd incidents with books flying out the bookcase and temperature changes. So there was a few little odd things like that.
And did it make its way into adulthood, or these were things that were just isolated to when you were a kid?
Well, yeah, I had, very briefly, I could say I had two sort of UFO sightings, which, again, were incredibly fleeting, but were very vivid and stayed with me. One of them, I actually remember, I can remember exactly what year it was, because I just watched this, the third episode of The X-Files, so as an X-Files connection, which it was Squeeze. So I just finished watching Squeeze when it was over the broadcast in the UK, so I don't know if that was 93 or 94 maybe.
I believe it was 93.
And I went outside my house, looked up into the sky, and saw what looked like three stars. They were just three lights that were sort of moving around each other in sort of concentric motions. And I stared at these for about a minute, and then ran inside to try and get my family out, and came back outside, and there was nothing to be seen. So again, the fact I just watched the X-Files, you could say, well, it's like Barney and Betty Hill might have seen an episode of The Outer Limits. So therefore, that was me being triggered or primed to see something, even though it wasn't even a UFO-related episode. But the other UFO sighting I had was maybe a bit later on, in about maybe 96 or 97. And I was walking home from high school through a little sort of, just a built-up area of houses. And I saw what looked like a sort of a gigantic blimp almost, or like a sort of a mothership, like a featureless sort of oval craft that was silently drifting very low above the houses. And I looked at this for like maybe 10, 15 seconds till it disappeared behind some buildings. And then I ran like crazy round down the road to see if I could see it again. And it was nowhere to be seen. And that was that. So
very strange. Professor Knowles, one of the main themes in your work recently that kind of aligns with the Scottish and Irish mythology has related to the siren. How has the siren kind of made its way in the past couple of decades into music and pop culture? Where do you keep seeing it popping up and relating to modern events and other things?
Well, you got to separate sirens and mermaids, which seem
Mhm.
to be two separate things, even though they're connected. As far as the siren goes, I mean, if you live in America, you can't go anywhere in any commercial or downtown area without seeing the siren. I mean, you're probably going to have a Starbucks in your town, and if you go into any supermarket or convenience store or gas station and go into the beverage section, you're going to see, it everywhere. I mean, it's almost like this conditioning process, to get us accustomed to this image, which just seems to be ubiquitous. But also, the mermaid thing, the past few years has really just exploded in a way that, I can't remember seeing. I mean, I keep expecting it to just sort of die down the way these things seem to. Like, we had like vampires when Twilight was popular. So, I just think that these things usually play themselves out, but the whole mermaid thing's been going on for quite some time. And, in any town in the United States, you're going to see a production at a school or a community theater or something of The Little Mermaid. And if you set a news alert on your Google or whatever you use, in very short time, if you just keyword mermaid, your inbox is just going to be flooded because it's just constant. And it seems to me like a conditioning process. It just seems to me like something that is being put into the culture from a top-down orientation and not so much from the ground up. I'm not exactly sure how much call and hue and cry there is for mermaid symbolism, but it's definitely a supply side situation. There's a number of explanations for this, or theories, really. I mean, I don't know if we do have, an actual explanation. I don't know if we have access to that information, but it just seems to be welling up in the culture. In America, in the summertime, you'll have several different mermaid parades, and there's a big one in Brooklyn. But they're all actually starting to pop up all over the place, and in places that are nowhere near the ocean, which fascinates me. You'll see these mermaid parades in the middle of the Midwest, or even like the Southwest. Nowhere near the ocean, nowhere near a river. I mean, it's a bombardment, and it just seems to be constant. So. You can posit a number of different theories about why this material and why this meme and this archetype is being foisted into the culture.
Mm-hmm.
But, I think that what we're seeing here is, this whole idea of ambiguity, of liminality, of breaking down categories and distinctions. In my most fevered paranoid fantasies, I feel like this is all leading towards a transgenic revolution, because at the same time we're seeing all this information and these archetypes in the media, we're also hearing a lot about CRISPR, Cas9, and other forms of gene editing. And, one of the things that it just blows my mind when I realize that it's actually happening is that the use of tilapia skin. A woman in Brazil who was born without a vagina had a vagina constructed for her out of tilapia skin. And I believe there was a trans woman who also had a vagina constructed for her out of tilapia skin. And they're also using tilapia skin now for burn victims and bandages and stuff. So this seems to be, very benign and not, terribly alarming or important. But if you realize that these kind of things usually start small, what we're seeing here is, a baby step towards, grafting. I mean, this is literally grafting. I mean, it's grafting non-human tissue onto the human body permanently. So that's usually how these things tend to start.
Well, you mentioned a kind of call. Could we agree that besides the origin place of the siren and the mermaid perhaps being in a similar part of the world, the same part of the world, they seem to have the same superpower, or one of their superpowers, which is this call, this haunting song that brings, ships, wrecks ships and calls men on adventures they otherwise wouldn't go on. It seems to have a hypnotic quality and is the hallmark of the siren, but belongs to the mermaid, or a kind of evil mermaid or something, as well as you see it depicted in fiction a lot. The Cockatoo twins, they seem to have an entity among them. Would you like to get into that kind of the connection between these supernatural entities and that young lady?
Well, this sort of strikes to the heart of where Colin lives. I mean, he could probably speak to this better than me, but you have the Kelpies, which were river horses that could shapeshift into women and call people with their song. But, you have this throughout the world. You have these various permutations of the mermaid and river spirits and river maidens and river goddesses that appear throughout fiction and mythology and folklore. It's interesting too that the siren itself, the sirens were originally bird women. They were ladybirds, so to speak. And who they were, and this is really fascinating, is that the original sirens were the handmaidens of Persephone. So when Persephone was abducted and taken down to hell by Pluto, and spent half the year as the queen of hell, her maidens became these bird women. And after a time, they sort of, I guess they went bad. I guess they went wrong, and they would gather on the shore and call men to be dashed against the rocks. But mermaids could also call up storms. They were associated with hurricanes and storms. They were associated with young men, particularly drowning in rivers and in lakes. So this is it's a fascinating archetype because it's like I said again, it's almost universal, but it also ties into what Stephen's been talking about with Lovecraft, because if you really look at the siren and you talk about the old ones returning and coming back to rule the world, you really can't do better than that archetype when you can't go anywhere without seeing the siren. And so there you go. It's like the harbinger of this process, and I think that Lovecraft was a fascinating figure in that I think he was, I don't know if it would be clairvoyant, but I think he had at the very least a very sensitive sense of perception where he could perceive the things that were sort of coming down the line and would see these kind of archetypes arising, 100 years after he's writing about them, and be very fearful of them. I mean, Lovecraft was basically what I would call a vaginaphobe, and he seemed, it doesn't really take Sigmund Freud to see what the basis of his anxieties were.
Right.
So, I just think that, this is a reality that we're dealing with, and it's something that has graduated from folklore to, again, ubiquity. I can't think of too many logos or symbols that are more ubiquitous than the siren is, at least in America. I don't know how it is in Scotland or England or other countries, but I do know that Starbucks are spreading like a bad rash.
Right. Right, and maybe there's something to that being entirely American. I brought up Cockatoo Twins, and you brought up young men drowning. Was there a young man that drowned or died in relation to the Cockatoo Twins' very own siren?
Yeah, well, that's a whole other discussion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because the way this all started, and this is really interesting when you talk about the synchronicities. So Elizabeth Fraser, is probably most of your listeners realize, did a cover of Tim Buckley's song "To the Siren" in 1983, and it eventually, lured siren-like. Tim Buckley had died in 1975 of a drug overdose, and his son was sort of, equally gifted, if not much more so than his father, and was sort of lured into Elizabeth Fraser, who is the singer of the Cockatoo Twins, spell, from the song. But it's really fascinating to me because the song was initially premiered on the very last episode of The Monkees. And The Monkees TV show, at its height, was a show that was watched by like 40 million people. And it was probably canceled because like only 20 million people were watching it. This is television in the 1960s. But, it was an episode about a crashed UFO, a very Roswell-like crashed UFO, and an evil wizard played by Rip Taylor, of all people, who steals the mind control technology of this crashed UFO and uses it to broadcast messages through television to, control the masses. So you just watch it and you're like, what the hell am I watching? This is insane. And and he's conquered by the power of marijuana, which is never really explicitly spelled out. But it's also interesting because it was the first time the Beatles had allowed their music to be used in a television show, a network television show. The song "Good Morning" off of Sgt. Pepper was used in an episode of the Monkees. John Lennon was a huge fan of the Monkees and had given them permission to use that song. But so that episode aired, and the next day there was a Aer Lingus crash, an airliner that went down in the Irish Sea, and it went into the sea, and everyone was lost. And then, geez, how many? So that's 15 years later. The version, it was actually released under the This Mortal Coil brand name, but so the new version of "Song to the Siren," a song that everyone had forgotten, was released, and it was released the day of the KOL 007 air crash, which was a famous Cold War knuckle-biting moment in which the Soviets had tracked an airliner that had wandered into their space and would not respond to calls and was shot down. And one of the passengers on that was a rather well-known sort of John Bircher kind of congressman named Larry McDonald. It was a Democratic congressman from
Texas.
Georgia.
Or Georgia.
Yeah, Georgia. And he was a real cold warrior as well. And this the downing of this airliner was on September 1st, 1983, was really one of the flashpoints of the Cold War. And there are a number of others that I've blogged about attached to the song, through osmosis. But the point being is that that's quite a synchronicity. And, things sort of went on from there. And Jeff Buckley eventually drowned in the Wolf River Harbor in Memphis, right under the giant, hideous black pyramid there. And that whole scenario was just really something out of an ancient myth, and kind of unleashed a lot of synchronistic emanations there too. So it's just fascinating how these things tend to inject themselves into the culture. But this, again, there's this whole idea of the Kelpies and the river horse, which takes the form of a beautiful woman and lures men to their deaths. And interestingly enough, in Elizabeth Fraser's hometown of Grangemouth, there are two giant statues of the Kelpies which seems to be an interesting coincidence because as far as my reading of ancient mythology, ancient Scottish folklore is concerned, the Kelpies had absolutely no connection to Grangemouth whatsoever. So take that for whatever it's worth.
And I don't want to go deeply into this, but just real quick for everybody listening, weren't some of those creatures and some of those beings present around that same Black Pyramid you're talking about, and related to what could be looked at as a sacrifice in the Vegas shooting?
Well, yeah, there was the Luxor Pyramid across the street from what's called Las Vegas Village. And oddly enough, in the film Mars Attacks, the Tim Burton film, the aliens are seen to be attacking that exact spot of real estate. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what that all means, but yeah, there are sphinxes and all sorts of cheesy Vegas-style, tacky, faux Egyptian images connected to that area. And of course, there's Janet Eyre and
right,
and all the rest of it. So it's a very significantly charged piece of real estate.
And you guys can go back and watch Mars Attacks if you think we're exaggerating about exactly which piece of real estate in question. So now that we've moved from kind of the beings and some of the sacred places, getting into the idea of ley lines in Scotland, and we're moving to America, Stephen, I've come up with a few questions for you. So just whatever you want to tackle in the last couple of minutes of conversation. But recently you found out some really interesting things around Scotland, whether we're talking about cockatoo twins or special forces, and then a lot of interesting things about the mounds that I brought up in the beginning of the show, the serpent mounds here in the U.S., and possible connections to Mothman, the Hellier documentary. Is there anything you right off the bat would like to add?
Well, I mean, sure. The mounds, of course, the first ones in North America actually emerged around the Gulf states, specifically in your kind of stomping ground over there in Louisiana, Florida, probably to some extent in the Mississippi and so forth. But the first really major mound building civilization that we have some decent documentation of was a culture that's been dubbed the Adena. We don't actually know what exactly they called themselves or anything to that effect. That was just the name that was given to them, I think, due to the town where they had first come into realization of the specific culture. But they were active around 1000 BC to about 2000 or 200 BC when they just kind of mysteriously vanished, which we'll get into in a little bit. But they were based really in the Ohio Valley area. That was sort of like the center point of their civilization, and then spread into Kentucky and western West Virginia. But also there's been settlements that have been found in Indiana, Wisconsin, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and so forth. But the two big ceremonial centers were in my home state and where I'm currently living in West Virginia. One was the Grave Creek Mound site in Moundsville, and also the one around Charleston, West Virginia, which was another major complex. Charleston is, of course, also now the capital of West Virginia. So anyway, they were eventually replaced at some point by another civilization that was dubbed the Hopewell, who were around from about 100 BC to 500 AD. And there's obviously a lot of dispute as to how exactly this happened. It's generally assumed that the Adena essentially intermarried with the Hopewell or something to that effect. But regardless, the Hopewell just crafted a phenomenally prosperous civilization. They established trade routes that just stretched all over the eastern part of North America. It went as far north as the Great Lakes region into Canada and so forth. It stretched as far west into Iowa and Kansas and that kind of area, and it went all the way down to the Gulf states. Louisiana, Florida were all sort of part of this. And of course, we kind of assume with the Native American tribes here in North America that they were mostly nomadic, but the Hopewell civilization really flies in the face of those assumptions. It was, very prosperous. It had a rather extensive trade route that was based around the Mississippi that brought materials from all over the eastern part, really, of North America to this particular civilization. So definitely it was, very impressive. I mean, given what we usually think of at the tribes in North America at the time. Now, getting into sort of the mystical practices of both the Adena and the Hopewell are very curious. Of course, the English magician Kenneth Grant, an acolyte of Aleister Crowley, we've talked about him in some of the earlier episodes, had argued that the Adena had forged links with entities spawned in the abyss, so to speak. Certainly, that's one of the theories surrounding a lot of the earth mounds that they constructed and so forth. And the Adena were really, I should emphasize, centered specifically upon the earth. A lot of their mounds were surrounded by these kind of sacred circles that were originally thought to have been fortifications, but they probably had a spiritual purpose more so than anything else. And the circles were believed to have been symbolic of the earth. And when they were replaced by the Hopewell were much more sky-oriented. Unlike the Adena, a lot of their mounds and monuments and so forth had astronomical, connections to it. A lot of them were aligned towards the solstices, the equinox, a lot of different lunar phenomenon and so forth. And the Hopewell preferred squares as sacred symbols. They did use some circles, but a lot of the squares were set up around their, sacred places. And typically there was a sacred fire that was kept in the center of these squares that was kind of symbolic of the sun, so to speak. Now, both of these cultures seem to have used entheogens to some extent in their rituals. Sacred ceremonial pipes were found very extensively in the mound sites and so forth. And it was most likely tobacco used, but the tobacco that was used in this era by the Native Americans was much stronger and much more potent than what we associate now and, modern day cigarettes and that type of thing. So there's a strong belief that it did produce some kind of narcotic effect on the users. And there's also pretty compelling evidence as well that the Hopewell used magic mushrooms. In fact, I've seen images of these kind of sorcerer's wands that have been found in the mounds that have mushroom caps essentially at the end of them. So definitely seems like that was a pretty prominent part of their mystical practices. And another interesting thing that I had really noted just recently was the use of reflective materials. A lot of the mounds were found with mica in it or obsidian, both of which are reflective surfaces. And of course, the obsidian especially has a long tradition in occult practices. The Aztecs used it as scurrying stones and things to that effect. Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, was believed to have used obsidian as scurrying stones. And of course, famously, the Elizabethan magician John Dee also apparently used obsidian for these purposes. And curiously, another one I found was the group, which was established in Italy during the early 20th century. This was the network, essentially, that Julius Evola had cut his teeth in when he was beginning to develop his occult practices in the 20s. And they also put a great emphasis on mirrors, which is essentially what all of these, materials were being used for as a way of contacting the other world. So it was definitely, I found that to be extremely curious. You have these sort of traditions of using these reflective surfaces the world over to contact entities from the other world. And that, of course, plays into the just absolutely fabulous Netflix show that Chris and Gordon White have written so elegantly on, called Requiem, which really went into some of the kind of theories with Enochian magic and so forth. So it's very curious to me that this sort of turns up in the Hopewell ritual sites especially. And another curious aspect of both the Adena and the Hopewell, but especially the Hopewell, was the use of decapitation, essentially. There's been several of the mound sites that have been found with headless bodies in it, with the Adena, where they were lined in a circle. The heads were actually placed between the femur bones. And then in some of the mounds, there was quite a extensive amount of what were dubbed trophy skulls found in them, essentially skulls that were probably cut off by the people buried there while they were still alive and had kept them as souvenirs, trophies, that effect. And this was especially prevalent among the Hopewell. So there is kind of this indication of kind of a headhunting type subculture or something to that effect that was present. And getting into some of the fairy traditions and so forth from Scotland, which, I was very interested in these connections. Of course, there's a lot of accounts of stones, sacred stones that were used to kind of transport down into the underworld. And I have kind of speculated that this was potentially what the mounds, at least when the Adena originally started to craft them, were meant to embody effectively. And there are some traditions from the successors to the Adena and the Hopewell that their ancestors had actually come from the underground and so forth. But there also was a bit of a change in all this with the rise of the Hopewell. As I kind of said before, the Hopewell were much more sky-oriented than the Adena. And there's been some theories that the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio might have been symbolic of this, kind of conflict between the two sides, essentially, where it has symbolism both from the heavens and from the earth, sort of playing against one another. And it's also certainly an area that's known for a lot of high weirdness. My wife actually had just met a woman, a Native American woman, a couple of months ago who had had quite an intense UFO experience at the Serpent Mound in Ohio.
That's all really interesting, and it leads me to think that one of the tribes, or the one more focused on the earth, may have been contacting or getting their knowledge from cryptoterrestrial beings or beings within the earth, or that came from the mounds, or in the case of the fairy, came from specific stone alignments or portals or doorways, and the other seems to be focused on actual aliens or knowledge that they may have not been able to gain by just looking up at the sky, but rather were receiving their whole, society layout as one does from entities, perhaps from the sky or from space or something, or that, or at least pretending they were.
Well, and I'm kind of reminded of, Chris's Lucifer's Technology series, too. As I said before, the Hopewell really seemed to have made some, significant advances as opposed to the Adena. They really had established quite an elaborate trader culture that stretched over a lot of the eastern United States into Canada and so forth. They were very prosperous and were able to craft much more sophisticated monuments like the Serpent Mound as opposed to, the mounds that the Adena did, which were, very impressive for the era, but certainly the Hopewell had really surpassed them in that regard.
Mm. So we have a lot of cases of just in terms of what types of beings we're talking about. We have beings that may be, the translation of the name of these entities in Scotland and Ireland and things relates to them being of the mound or from like an inner earth kind of civilization. And then when you get into the recent documentary Hellier, the second season of which just came out on Amazon, I think, last week, we start getting into ideas, whether from ancient times or from a tradition of running into a kind of unidentifiable being, that there's these little white people or little white beings, hairless children, as they're initially referred to, but we're definitely talking about gray aliens who live in the mines in Kentucky and may even relate to some of the crypto-industrial activity in West Virginia and so forth. Of course, I'm talking about Mothman and things like that. So we have these old industrial sites, or we have this elaborate system of abandoned mines, all that have these surrounding legends about the Greys. But then also in Kentucky, we have the Kentucky Goblins case, which seems like it's those exact same gray alien, same height, same body, same color of flesh, everything. They just happen to have some sort of what's been theorized as a breathing apparatus, or their whatever mask they put on to come up to the surface, or perhaps it's all for deception. But
well, the interesting thing too about Kentucky is it actually has what I understand is the largest underground cave system in the world. It's known as the Mammoth Cave System, and supposedly it connects into a lot of Appalachia, especially into the, kind of western area in West Virginia. That's, the whole Mothman area and so forth. Also around where Great Creek Mound would be located in Moundsville and that type of thing. So you do have this kind of, enormous cave system, very elaborate, that's running through this whole area. And of course, ironically, Lovecraft actually had a short story that he had set in the Mammoth Cave system as well. So, yeah, it's very curious, to put it mildly.
Certainly, certainly. Does anybody else have anything they want to add to that? I have a thought that ran away.
Yeah, I have a few things, if that's okay.
Surely.
So yeah, in relation to a bunch of that stuff, incidentally, the not the village I grew up in, but the town Alloa, which is also quite near in that central Scotland area, the primary industry of that place up until the 70s and 80s was coal mining. So that's maybe a little connection. But the other thing I was thinking about the other day as well is that in relation to, as well, to the Kentucky Goblins case, is how many of, let's say, the classic UFO alien encounters, witnesses, abductees were connected to farming or forestry, or had close proximity, at least to, you know, the outdoors, to nature, to lakes, you know. I mean, you had, in Scotland, very near where I am, we had, I don't know if you maybe were familiar with the Robert Taylor case that happened in 1979. He was a forestry worker. He was a forestry worker in Livingston, which is a little town just near where I am now in Edinburgh. And he went out one morning with his dog, and he was seemingly assaulted by a UFO of some kind that left trace elements on the forest floor. And he had his trousers, his pants were ripped off by what looked like two flying, you know, spiked landmines. And he was struck with a mysterious gas that knocked him unconscious. And it's the only UFO case in British history that's ever been investigated by the police.
Oh, wow.
And,
yeah, I do know that case. I know exactly what you're talking about.
And it almost makes me think a little bit of Travis Walton, who also was a forestry worker. I mean, or farmers. You had they were at an isolated location, and the whole, I believe with that case, it was the origin of both the joke about hillbillies and like crazy people out in the woods having encounters with aliens, and also the phrase "little green men," I think, comes from that case. And it was also it also nearly it inspired both Spielberg's film E.T. and then Poltergeist, I think, because he was going to make that movie based on it, but he never did, in the sort of pop culture thing. Yeah, so just, thinking about that notion, to bring it back to the fairies, of elementals or nature spirits existing in these liminal in-between spaces that are close to nature and away from, you know, human society.
Yeah, there's definitely a priority to, you know, get people alone and get people in the middle of nowhere. All you need to do is go back in the fairy lore to see that the people wandering alone seems to be a key element. But I can't help but think this has something to do, if we can at least tie this up in the U.S., with the 411, with the statistically anomalous amount of missing people within our national park. Yes.
Yeah, I just want to add something, you know, and this sort of ties in to tie all this stuff, you know, especially what Stephen and Colin are talking about, is that, you know, the waves of migration from Europe that settled in this area that we're talking about were primarily Scottish or Scots-Irish, which is sort of border Scots, you know, sort of this mixture of lowland Scots and Northern English. So, it's, you know, I think that's something that you can't really overlook, is that in West Virginia, you know, up through the Appalachians, you have a high degree of Scottish ancestry and heritage, and I would argue folk magic in that area.
So are we dealing with the migration of a culture and its beliefs, or the migration of certain beings still being after the same bloodlines, the same type of humans?
I don't know if I could answer that. I think that's really that's like a book's, you know, or an encyclopedia's worth of arguments to be making there. I just think it's interesting, but you know, you also, I mean, one of the things that people tend to overlook is that in this area, you know, and throughout all of America, really, but you know, particularly in the Appalachian area and also the Northeast, you had a high degree of intermarriage between native populations and you know, particularly the Scots and Scots-Irish populations. And really what the hillbillies were this sort of blending of these two
populations to a large degree. For instance, in New Jersey, there's a group of people that are known as the Jackson Whites, and that's a group of predominantly again Scots-Irish mountain folk and Native Americans who intermarried and interbred and formed this sort of completely unique culture. And I think a lot of the magic that you see Lovecraft talk about and some of the things that he's horrified are really this blending of I would argue Scots-Irish folk magic, Native American, and maybe even some African and Caribbean forms of magic, and then sort of blended with esoteric or mystical irregular masonry.
Mm-hmm.
And if I could jump in for a second too,
Sure.
Going into like what Chris was saying with the kind of Scotch-Irish connection, I've found some other really, curious instances of that even in regions outside of Appalachia. One of the ones that is, very kind of dear to my heart would be New Smyrna Beach, which is in Florida. This is a little south of where I spent a lot of my formative years in. And it's one of the oldest cities in Florida. I think it's generally considered to be the second oldest behind St. Augustine. It's not very far from St. Augustine, probably a little over an hour or so by car. But anyway, it has, I believe, what is the largest Indian mound in the state of Florida there, which was the Turtle Mound, which is on the beach at New Smyrna. It was actually built almost entirely out of seashells by a tribe named the Timucua, I believe. Anyway, when it was founded as a city here, as a colony, the guy who set it up was naturally a Scottish physician named Dr. Andrew Turnbull. And Turnbull actually built his plantation house on top of one of the mounds that is now in the downtown area of New Smyrna. And a lot of people aren't familiar with the history of this, but it was just utterly brutal. He brought in about 1,300 settlers, quote unquote. They were actually indentured servants, but it's not necessarily politically correct always to talk about that now. But a lot of them were from Greece and Minicara, I believe, or something like that, a Catalonian kind of island centric around the coast of Spain. But they were essentially worked to death. Quite a few of them died, and eventually the situation became so dire that they basically just all abandoned the colony and marched up to St. Augustine and demanded release from just the horrible conditions there. Like I said, at least, yes, there was only about 600 or so survivors. So, I mean, almost half of the colony died in, just a matter of years. It was just horrendous. And it all took place against the backdrop of these, mounds there. And kind of in a bizarre sort of circumstances for me, my wife is actually a descendant from her father's side, I believe, from the settlers who were basically worked to death in this colony. So, you still have this kind of presence of Scotsman who was overseeing all of this insanity. And it is very curious in the context of what Chris was just talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The only reason I was jumping to the are we dealing with these kinds of people or just their culture is because it's that same mix of genetics of Scotch, Irish, and Native American that are by far most commonly abducted. Most abductees fit into that, but abductees, contactees, and experiencers, that's still the largest stat. And it was absolutely the genetics sought out for super soldier programs. I've always found that commonality bizarre. Steven, do you have anything on that or not so much?
Well, I mean, I wasn't really kind of planning on jumping into that, but I mean, certainly you can see the cultural similarities from what we've been kind of discussing on the one hand with the mounds that are sort of prevalent throughout Scotland and Ireland and so forth, and these other sort of megalithic structures, and in turn, what you're also seeing in the eastern part of North America with the mound building civilizations here. So, I mean, certainly at a minimum, I would imagine that some of the Scotsmen that were coming over here in the waves of migration would have seen these mounds and probably would have been struck by the familiarity with the same type of landscape that they had grown up with in Scotland and Ireland and so forth. And certainly the possibility that there were more enlightened individuals within these waves of migrations that had a more specific ideal of what they represented is also quite distinct, I would say, as well.
Or how to use them,
Yes, exactly.
How many generations would it have taken to, or is this a line you can draw from people arriving here who understand how to utilize the mounds the way they were initially meant, or a magical system to use them as some kind of dimensional doorway or a place of contact for other beings? And then how many generations did it take before someone's great grandkids didn't even have an understanding of the culture, let alone the magical system, but perhaps were, being abducted out of their bed in the middle of the night. But that's just for everybody.
Actually, I was going to say, actually, I mean, I think if anything, most of the populace would have been rather concerned by the presence of these things here, because really, especially in Appalachia, there actually seems to have been a pretty thorough attempt to destroy a lot of the mounds. In point of fact, a lot of them were taken apart by farmers and so forth. And, I'm sure a lot of that was for practical purposes. But, I suspect some people might have been aware of the more potentially sinister implications of them and thought that it might be prudent to eliminate them, so to speak.
Yeah, or just didn't think they had any power at all and needed their cows to graze there or something. So it was, just a necessity out of
yes.
They fall with logic. Yeah. So does anyone have anything else on those topics before I totally turn the corner into something else?
I had a quick thing there, just with regards to that you were saying before, but that idea of bloodlines, and also in relation to the abduction thing. One of the sort of things with fairies and folklore is that maybe it's a little bit like the vampires. You have to make an agreement with you, or they'll offer you something. This also maybe ties into like the stuff Joshua Cutchin's been writing about, food from fairies, and so that if you do a deal, if you agree to do something with a fairy, then they'll take you away to their kingdom, and it's that whole thing as well with giving the changeling. And of course, you can take that sort of folkloric thing and put it onto the abduction thing, and maybe even that goes into the super soldier thing, because I know a lot of the super soldier people talk about how it's intergenerational, it's in their family history, their bloodline, whether they're from the States or whether they're from the UK. They often are like, well, my uncle was involved in this and my father was involved in this, and there was this whole generational line going through. And that's how and also how the super soldier stuff seems to pull in almost everything from all kinds of angles. There's occult stuff, and there's alien stuff, and there's other supernatural stuff.
Yeah, just like some of the other mind control systems are supposed to work. They seem to factor in all kind of popular culture and media, and then also have a focus on the ancestry, and then
that you were born into it, and you have no choice in that sort of situation.
And those people will admit to you, if you actually get to talk to the individuals in these programs or these bloodlines, that not only do they have their third or fourth generation military families, but they also are a little more hush-hush about, but will admit, are generational abductees. So they usually have all that going on at once. It's hard for a researcher, let alone an individual experiencing this, to parse it apart and discern what from what. But okay, so just totally changing topic here. But still in some of the same areas of the U.S. and same areas of investigation. What do you guys think the Men in Black actually are? Because
silence. Nobody knows.
we hear that. I mean, initially it was thought these are just government agents or, members of the Air Force or whatever, dressing up and playing a game to be ultimately threatening, so a person really did shut up. And then once you start getting so many Men in Black cases in one place and you're reading through them, you realize that there's a real non-human oddity about them. They seem to be on a time limit. Sometimes one Men in Black will be staring you down and trying to convince you that you're not going to talk about a UFO, and out the corner of your eye, you see the other Men in Black attempt to drink a bottle of a container of salt as if it's a Gatorade, and then all of a sudden starts dehydrating, and then the time limit is quickened, and they need to get out of the situation because they've done something so inhuman. They've messed up whatever their physiology is. Now, my next question was just, what do you guys think the black-eyed kids are? Because the two seem to be interrelated, related to the UFO phenomenon, but we don't know if this is what's referred to as like windows in the documentary Hellier, whereas in the same place you'll see a fairy and a UFO, or a Bigfoot and a UFO in the same part of a forest or something, or whether they actually interact, because one or two times people could see where the black-eyed kids wound up, they were getting into a Men in Black's car. And 1 out of 3 of those cases, the Men in Black didn't even have faces, which goes into these cases of sort of mannequin people and things. But did anybody have any guesses or thoughts on any of that phenomenon?
Well, I mean, clearly, I mean, there's been kind of accounts of this, at least going back to Europe in the Middle Ages. I mean, I'm sure, even earlier, but I mean, frequently, when you look at sort of some occult literature from Europe going into the Middle Ages, there's, repeated references to a black man, sometimes who's seen as a personification of the devil. And when I say black man, I'm not, really referring to an African American per se,
Right.
but just more an individual who was described as a dark, shadowy figure, effectively. And of course, there's speculation, especially with some of the witch cults in Scotland and so forth, that the warlock would have donned this kind of persona as a kind of symbolic magic and so forth. And then something I've kind of gotten into in some of the other podcasts, but probably a little bit beyond the scope of this one. But I also have wondered to some extent if the Sovereign Military Order of Malta had also sort of taken on these, black cloaks and so forth as a similar kind of symbolic magic in that sense. Certainly, in a lot of my research going back throughout history, they do kind of seem to be this organization that kind of suppresses a lot of these other mystically inclined orders, or absorbs them, so to speak, into their own ranks.
Or they're harbingers of danger in the way that we were saying sirens and mermaids are. And the further you go back, they do have a difference in the way they dress, and if they're related to bringing disease or silencing occult or supernatural matters. However, since the time when the dress was appropriate, around 1940, 1950, they have been stuck in sort of this 1940s, 1950s dress, the use of those vehicles. The vehicles obviously aren't driving around the way we understand normal cars do, so so we don't know if that's part of the shtick to look like they just fit in modern times or can fit somewhere in. It seems like they can pinpoint, or they're out of time and they come into our time and attempt to blend into this 50 to 80 year period where, a black suit and a certain Cadillac or whatever would be relevant, or at least possible. But they still, in every other way, well, in all ways, don't seem like they're actually, they don't seem like they're living amongst us somewhere on the world as we speak. They seem like they come from somewhere else, like a lot of these other beings. And then, unlike a lot of these other beings, even the black-eyed kids, they seem to have a time limit to them. They're going to expire however long they can hang out and threaten people or whatever, however confident and egotistical they may seem right off the bat, or the kind of emotional manipulation and the inducement of absolute fear that both the black-eyed kids and the Men in Black exhibit. They are also very fragile and seem to, it all seems to be a bit of theater, and they don't seem like normal humans at all pretending.
Yeah, well, it sort of ties into that idea that supernatural beings shift and change their appearances with the flow of popular culture and with society. If they somehow are, feeding on our preconceived notions of what we're going to see, and it's the idea of they are just like shapeshifters. They fit themselves to what they think is going to serve their purposes based on whoever they're dealing with.
And the black-eyed kids, and certainly different scenarios with aliens, seem like that. But the Men in Black, to me, still seem like there's something else, robotic or drone-like, or something we totally don't understand. The black-eyed kids are certainly in intelligence inhabiting a human body for a particular purpose. And that's what I always thought the Men in Black were. And the movie Dark City does the greatest reveal of this, if you're able to kind of, see through the lines there. And that's the explanation that one of the guys in Black, in Dark City, one of the alien guys explains, and he says that, we use your dead as vessels to essentially move around and confuse and study you and your emotional reactions or whatever by building this world. And this gets a lot into what I tend to think might be the most plausible explanation for a simulation. And then you have maybe countless, but maybe just 15 different intelligences that know how to hack and appear and communicate and interface with us in the simulation. And some of them are stuck to a form. Some of them are shape-shifting trickster types mythologically, like you're talking about, Colin. And some of them, back to the first thing I said, stuck to the form of a gray alien, or stuck to the form of looking like you grave robbed some guys who freshly died in 1948, and you're using their body 10 days after they were buried in 1970 something to scare the hell out of someone who
and the fact that we're also getting, we're still having encounters with Pleiadian light beings that look like Nordic people, and they vibrate at a higher rate of frequency and come from Venus, and that's still going on. That's
yeah. I actually saw a YouTube video that was saying that the light beings in Scotland have a connection to the Pleiades. I don't know how that really makes sense, but they later made the example that just like in Mount Shasta, where you have a general window area where different beings can come in and out, you have a sort of a long tradition of some positive beings being around that area and being able to sort of lift the vibrations of humans, if you will, as well as you have the Deo, I believe is the name of them, which is the crypto-terrestrial beings that live in the mountain and fly UFOs and have all kind of weird appearances in our history. So does anyone, this will be more for another episode, but I'm just kind of laying the idea out there because this is where I wanted all this to go. And I want to have Alan Greenfield on if you guys are down to add him to the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Since he's an expert in this area. Does anyone understand the secret cipher of the UFO knots? Or quite simply, does anyone understand the sort of ritual magic with a K that is done by the men?
Just briefly, I have a slightly weird experience related to that book, but we can save that for another time, I guess. But in relation to that, briefly, I was just looking at a book by a guy called John Matthews, which is, again, it's called The Shida, we're not sure how to pronounce that, Wisdom from the Celtic Otherworld. And this was a guy, I think it was published in 2004, it's quite a small book, and it's a guy who travelled around the British Isles and Ireland, picking up fairy lore, and essentially it is like a contactee, like a channeled contactee book, and the fairies he's communicating with in this book warn of great disasters and how you can, avoid those. And he provides you at the end of the book with a very sort of aboriginal looking to me, like something from the Aboriginal Dreamtime, like a Celtic circle, which he's calling a glyph. And then if you meditate on that, you can then easily contact the fairy realm. And that really reminded me of what is in the secret ciphers of the Men in Black, is in the Alan Greenfield books, which is all a bit Mothman, of using a particular sort of occult sort of method to contact these beings.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it goes back to the obsidian and everything else. If you have the tools and you have the language, I think even David Bowie would agree, there's a way to draw up a door and interface with, the given beings that you've found the occult phone number to. The Men in Black and the Black-Eyed Kids are the only beings where this starts becoming really desperate. And instead of, being able to publicly sell a manual to contact the Pleiades or any light beings, you have a tradition of people throwing away any books or literature about both the Men in Black and Black-Eyed Kids, and some people who just out of complete natural curiosity pick up some material, a documentary or a book on the black-eyed kids, and that literally invites them into their reality within a week. There's a warning on the book I have, Nick Redfern's Black Diary, which talks about the men in black, the women in black, and the black-eyed children in dangerous books, humorously enough. And on the top of the book, it says, just picking up this book invites them in. It's a good way to sell books, but I've run into a number of cases where people have actually, freaked out, not even wanted to give their name and such after saying that they were just gay and wanting to.
I've often heard people say that if you go out looking for this, then it will come to you. Whatever it is you're looking for. If you go out looking for UFOs, you might see UFOs.
Right, and it's that whole idea. I think we've learned time and time again about sync and synchronicity and research, and when you really, really focus on something, I think if your will is good and your intentions are good, that turns into, you look up the one other book that you need to find, on Amazon, and there's only one for $7,000, and then you happen to just agree to go with a family member to a garage sale or accompany them to something you have to do in your everyday life, and there is the book for 25 cents. And I've had that all throughout my life, whether it be I just needed that one issue of Wolverine to complete the collection, or whether I was into something really obscure, like the Secret Cipher of the UFO Knots, and then came across that kind of thing, just through some other, but without me directly trying to find it or invite the object in my life. But anyway, we can wrap up this episode, you guys. Did anybody have anything to add to that, or they wanted to say in closing?
Well, there was actually also one other interesting footnote I thought that was kind of curious with the kind of famous Kentucky hobgoblin flap from the 50s. And, it's always been an incident that a lot of UFOologists have kind of struggled with because it was so strange, especially since, they're essentially claiming to have seen goblins and something to that effect. And, this kind of plays into a lot of the stuff we're talking about. Obviously, this goes well beyond the kind of conventional nuts and bolts, UFO experiences and so forth with the Greys. But ironically, the CIA actually took the Kentucky hobgoblin flap very, very seriously. In 1956, they arranged for John Mulholland to go out there and discreetly investigate it. Mulholland was a professional stage magician who had been enlisted by Sidney Gottlieb and MK Ultra, initially to kind of instruct some of the participants in sleight of hands and so forth in the event that, you wanted to slip poison to somebody or something to that effect. But he later was used to investigate a lot of the paranormal phenomenon that they encountered. Ironically, he quite despised Andrina Puharich. Gottlieb had actually sent him to investigate Puharich, who had principally been working more with the artichoke crowd. And Mulholland was very unimpressed with Puharich, to put it mildly. But anyway, Mulholland was also, very well connected. He was essentially a Rockefeller stooge. If I remember correctly, he was very close to Nelson specifically. And of course, the Rockefeller family did underwrite a lot of the funding for MK Ultra. So in a sense, Mulholland was probably a guy attached to it to also, kind of keep an eye on how their money was being spent, so to speak. But I don't know if Mulholland was specifically sent to investigate the Kentucky incident because of MK Ultra. Hank Albarella had asked Gottlieb point blank when he interviewed him in 1997 if it was related to it, and Gottlieb kind of passed on the question while going into how interesting the UFO phenomena was and so forth. So, yeah, you have these, we've kind of gotten into this a little bit, but Artichoke, MK Ultra, these went well beyond mind control. I think really fundamentally they were concerned with, essentially assaulting the very nature of our reality itself. And it is, certainly interesting that you had Mulholland, a guy who was involved with all this, a guy who was very close to the Rockefeller family, who was specifically sent out to investigate this just, really bizarre UFO incident that a lot of UFOologists don't even take seriously.
Yeah, and then there's the intelligence connections, or rather the field of sort of secret mind control research is always way too intimately tied with the exact same players with the UFO phenomenon. And over the years, I've just guessed it has something to do with, if we had the whole curriculum in front of us, we'd realize that psychic powers get to how you would drive the UFO if you sat inside of it. The kind of quantum physics we've been ignoring this whole time or putting off explains the way the ships come in and out of our dimension, if they even do, and the interface between us and alien minds or alien genetics might be a lot closer than we think, but we've been pushing all these things to the extreme edge and almost pushing them off the table of the debate, whether it be psychic phenomenon or whether it be ritual magic, or whether it be people actually interfacing with aliens in a way they can't control. But I've said enough there. Is everybody else done? We'll wrap this up. All right. Well, thank you guys for joining me. And everybody, thank you for listening to The Farm. And we'll be back next week. Everybody have a good day. Bye-bye.